Hey guys, welcome back to the channel where you can find all of your basic guides on Total War games. Today we are looking at each individual unit's role of the Norsca faction. Norsca has cheap Marauder infantry and cavalry backed up by various large monstrous units and very few ranged options. Their main focus on the battlefield will be their monstrous infantry and units. Timestamps can be found in the description if you would like to skip to a particular portion of the video. The Skin Wolf Werekin is a solid fighter hero that can deal a significant amount of damage to large units while also regenerating. Keep him mainly fighting monstrous units or mounted lords. There are two Fimir Fiends in the Norscan roster. One has access to the Fire Spell Tree and the other has access to the Shadow. The Fire Spell Tree has access to buff spells and damaging spells, while the Shadow Spell Tree is a nice combination of debuffs and controllable area damage. Regardless of which you choose, you will need to try to keep them Fimir Fiend out of combat. There are three different types of Shaman Sorcerers: a Metal Sorcerer, mainly known for their spells that deal damage over time to a unit. This is mainly useful for the Dwarves. A Death Sorcerer, which is mainly focused on straightforward targeted damage, and another Sorcerer with access to the Fire Spell Tree. You will need to try to keep him away from any other lords and heroes, as he would die very quickly if he is caught out. The Marauders are a solid low-tier frontline infantry and will be the bulk of your frontline for the early game. Their rage allows them to stay in a fight longer through bonuses to leadership and possibly deal more damage should they stay in combat long enough to get their melee attack buff from their rage ability. These Marauders are meant to get into combat as fast as possible. These Marauder Spearmen are similar to the Marauders with the added bonus of anti-large and a higher melee defense rather than having shields. They do a decent job at pinning down large units, but are definitely hampered by their lack of armor. Due to not having shields, they are extremely vulnerable to missile fire, and keep these guys on your flanks. The Marauders with great weapons truly embrace the damage dealing aspect. Losing their shields, these units are meant to be sent after the heavily armored infantry, although they will take a large amount of damage in return due to their low melee defense. Similar to the Spearmen, they are also vulnerable to missile fire, so you will need to keep them in reserves to keep them away from missile fire and bolster any parts of your frontline that need help, preferably the ones engaged with armored infantry. The Berserkers are a powerful infantry killer. The longer they fight, the more effective they become, with progressive bonuses to leadership and physical resistance. These will be used to bolster your frontline engagements. Send them in once the frontlines have engaged so they take less damage in combat. The Marauder Champions are a very effective elite infantry. They will hold the line well against other elite units and crush through lower tier infantry. With high melee defense and weapon damage, they would take a while to cut through and give back a good amount of damage. Their rage mechanic also gives them buffs that favor their staying power and difficulty to kill. They should be placed within your front lines once you get access to them. The Marauder Champions with great weapons are your elite infantry used for dealing with heavily armored units. They themselves are heavily armored, so they will easily have the advantage when sent after heavily armored infantry. Mainly keep these in reserves and send them into the portions of your front lines engaged with heavily armored units. Marauder Hunters have a unique effect called Shield Breaker. This effect lowers the enemy's missile block chance by 24, which is quite large. The regular Hunters trade off range and ammo for armor-piercing damage. Given their Shield Breaker effect, they can fire at the fronts of the enemy front lines, but if you can, bring them around to fire into their flanks to maximize their damage. Also be sure to focus the more heavily armored infantry. The Javelin units do not have armor-piercing damage, but they do have a decent range, ammo, and anti-large bonuses. These are best suited for volleying into the backs of the enemy front lines, or you can use them to focus fire down large monsters and cav with their anti-large bonuses. These are also decent melee combatants, so they aren't completely useless if they run out of ammunition. The Marauder Chariots are a high-mass anti-infantry shock unit. They specialize in breaking through thin lines and crashing into enemy flanks. Just like almost every chariot unit, they mainly rely on their charge bonus and should always be kept moving. Do not leave these guys in prolonged combat. The Ice Wolf Chariots are a big upgrade from the Marauder Chariots. Their melee attacks lower the speed of their targets. They also have armor-piercing range attacks, and its speed is on par with light cav and hound units. This can be brought to easily tear into the flanks of the enemy front lines. The Marauder Horsemen are your light cav. They should be used for shutting down ranged infantry or artillery pieces. You should try to avoid charging them into melee infantry as they would take damage very quickly. The Marauder Horsemen with throwing axes are great for dealing damage to armored units. They are the mobile version of the Marauder Hunters and can fire while moving. They can easily be brought around the flanks of the enemy front lines and volley armor-piercing missiles into their backs. For this, it may be better just to bring Marauder Horsemen with throwing axes instead of the Marauder Hunters. The Marauder Horsemasters are basically just the upgraded version of the Marauder Horsemen. They are still considered light cav and should not be left in prolonged combat with melee infantry. They will have the same roles as the Marauder Horsemen. The Norscan Warhounds are just like any other hound unit in Warhammer, extremely fast and squishy. They should mainly be used for killing light ranged infantry, artillery, and routing units. The Ice Wolves are a much stronger version of the Norscan Warhounds and should always be taken over them. They fulfill their exact role but do it better. The Norscan Trolls have very low leadership, which leaves them prone to routing early in the battle. These should be used on your front lines. Make sure your frontline infantry engages first and then send them in to ensure their models do not get surrounded and start taking a lot of damage. Compared to the regular Norsca Trolls, the Ice Trolls have higher melee attack, slow their targets, and overall have more damage. They are the better option of the two, but come with a crucial weakness to fire. The Skin Wolves are a great unit that form a crucial part of the Norscan army. Their anti-large and frenzy mean they can deal a good amount of damage to large threats. They also have the speed of cav alongside regeneration, which means they can catch up to fast cav and monstrous units. They do not have the best armor-piercing damage, but their frenzy and anti-large make up for it against the large units. These should be placed on the flanks of your front lines to give them the opportunity to catch cav trying to get into your backline. Also, make sure to avoid swarms of infantry and missile attacks as their low armor makes them vulnerable. Just as it says in the name, armored Skin Wolves have more armor at the cost of speed. These should be brought if you anticipate large amounts of enemy ranged infantry. Other than that, the regular Skin Wolves are preferred. The Fimir Warriors are a great unit used for fighting in the front lines. They have good armor-piercing damage, are armored, and have armor sundering, which lowers their target's armor. They also have the effect from the mist, which gives them even more missile resistance, provided their leadership stays above 50%. Like all frontline monstrous infantry, make sure to engage your melee infantry first and then send them into the fight. The Fimir Warriors with great weapons are probably tied with the Skin Wolves for being the most useful unit on the roster. They combine anti-large with armor piercing and armor sundering. They can easily deal with most large units and do decently well against armored infantry. Be sure to keep them in reserves so you can send them after the large units engage with your infantry. The Giant is a well-rounded armor-piercing unit. While they are decent at grinding through infantry, the Mammoth is the more preferred option of the two. The Pharaoh Mammoth is quite decent for being the lowest tier of mammoths. It has good armor-piercing damage and anti-infantry bonuses. They can easily be used to terror out the enemy front lines. Just be sure to protect it from missile fire and anti-large infantry. The Frostworms are dragons, which are incredibly useful and powerful combatants on their own. They bring the Frostbite effect, which slows enemies and lowers their melee defense. This is great for debuffing a good portion of the enemy front lines. Their breath attack helps them absolutely devastate infantry blobs. Use the Frostworm to wreak havoc on the frontline engagements. Although expensive, the War Mammoth can be considered to be a very effective melee unit in the Norscan roster. They have the same role as the Feral Mammoth and are the preferred version of the two. The War Shrine War Mammoth has the same stats as the War Mammoth, but it brings two abilities to the battlefield, buffing melee attack and leadership. This Mammoth gives your front lines a significant buff, and you should always bring at least one to support your front lines. So that about wraps it up for our Norsca unit roster guide. Hope you found it useful for your Norsca campaigns. You can find my suggestions for early and late game army comps in the video description. If you enjoyed this content here, make sure you drop a like. Also, hit that subscribe button to keep up to date on any future guides.